Well, we're heading up to 4:30. Good to have you with us here on today, the Wednesday edition of the show. I'm Gareth Edwards. Dan Moyane is away for today. South Africa, we're looking to address some of its water and sanitation problems at large. It's all taking place, though, at a summit over in Namibia. The 7th Africa Sanitation Conference underway in Swakopmund. It's convened by the African Ministers' Council on Water, as well as the Commission of the African Union. It's going to be attended by a host of ministers and heads of delegations responsible for sanitation and hygiene here in Africa. They want to essentially improve access to safely managed and sustainable sanitation services throughout the region. It's quite a task. The Deputy Director General for Water and Sanitation Services, Risimati Mathye, part of the SA delegation over in Namibia, joining us live from Swakopmund this afternoon. It's quite a lot you have on your plate this afternoon and at this conference. Risimati, good to have you with us. And where do you try and begin, A? And then B, let's be honest, let's have an honest conversation. How bad are we with our water and sanitation compared to our other African countries? Afternoon.
Afternoon. Thanks for having us. I could see your hand is quite strict, A and B. Let me say that when we look at the country, we have our own challenges, of course. You would have seen the recent publication by State SA. When you talk sanitation access to our residents, basically our citizens, we are looking at roughly around 83.4 or so percent. So we still have a deficit in terms of access to sanitation. But the majority of our communities in the country, most especially in urban areas, they have what you call the full waterborne services. But when we compare ourselves against some of the African countries, we are actually doing quite well. We have compared some of our progress as a country with some of the African countries here in the conference, and we are actually doing quite well. First of all, it's how the country has actually moved in developing what we call the National Sanitation Framework, which seeks to outlaw some of the old provision of sanitation in terms of your VIPs and buckets that are quite common in some of the informal and formal settlements in the country. Now, that move has actually put South Africa ahead of most of the countries. And when we are sharing notes in terms of how we are doing well in terms of our research and technology led by some of our institutions and a Water Research Commission, we're actually quite ahead. However, the gap that we have as a country is basically to implement these policies in an accredited manner, specifically in a coordinated manner with our municipalities. That's where some of the gaps we are finding as a country.
I would suggest another one of the big gaps is not a lack of infrastructure in South Africa, it's a lack of infrastructure management. The structures were there, just wasn't managed.
You're quite right. You know very well that when we release our green drop, some of the findings that we have in our municipalities is that there is actually a deficit when it comes to operations and maintenance. That has come out quite strong even when we do our municipal self-assessment that we do across all our water service authorities. So that has come out as a gap. However, the fact that we have actually reproduced our green drop, which was not coming through in the past couple of years, is now giving us an edge to ensure that there's at least compliance and that there's proper budgeting and alignment of this budget to deal with some of the deficiencies that we are actually picking up as we go.
When we look at this year's conference, it's themed, and I quote, the strengthening systems and partnerships for accelerated action on safely managed sanitation and hygiene. Talk to me about partnerships. Who are we learning what from? Because critically, I can't imagine there's much they're learning from us.
They are actually learning from us. You'll be surprised. What we are looking at this partnership is, in the past, basically in our country, we have been so much reliant on the fiscus, to implement the sanitation infrastructure in terms of our wastewater works, upgrade and refurbishment. Now, we have actually not looked much in terms of using sanitation or the effluent as a form of reuse. We have actually done very little in that space, the integration of technology, and also to open a space for the private sector to partner with government in ensuring that sanitation is not necessarily to be disposed of, in this case, the fecal sludge. However, it can be reused and it can actually generate energy in some form. So some of these lessons are coming up, and also to pick up that the private sector is actually quite interested because there's actually an underinvestment when it comes to issues of sanitation. So these lessons are what we're picking up as a country, even comparing with some of the countries here.
Private partnerships very much being pinned to the hopes of government right now because government can't do the job. Private needs to come in with money and do it properly. Is that a fair critique?
I think maybe you can say that, but I think what is being looked at, it's the private sector has interest. They bring technology, they bring other forms of funding. Not that the government doesn't have all the skills and so forth, but however, even when the private sector does investment, there still needs to get that guarantees from government's fiscus, and in this case, it's actually more like a blended finance to ensure that this infrastructure gets accelerated. So you have to look at it from a blended finance component to ensure that at least the private sector plays a role. And I must say this, Gareth, that in the past, we have always looked at sanitation as the end product that can just be disposed of, but it's quite expensive and costly to ferry sludge from wastewater works, whether it's actually drying up or emptying some of the pit latrines to actually dispose of. It is actually quite expensive. But when you look at some of the Western countries, they've moved ahead to develop some of the technologies to reuse some of this sludge. And the private sector is actually quite interested in that because it actually offsets some of their investment in terms of electricity as and when needed.
If there's money to be made from partnerships like this with the private sector, why not just give them full control?
You would have heard us, Gareth, that what the government is doing, specifically Department of Water and Sanitation, championed by the minister, we have gone as far as trying to do some of the reforms where we are working on the licensing of water service authority and water service providers. And in this case, we are trying to open a space through our Water Partnership Office, which is co-funded by National Treasury and ourselves in partnership with SALGA. Now, this is a space where we are saying the private sector will have a chance to partner with government, bring the skills, bring the technology, bring the co-funding so that at least the enhancement and the integration of the two sectors can actually make sure that there's acceleration of service delivery. And of course, government is not outside of the private sector. We have to work with the private sector because there's a skill and investment that government can basically benefit from that.
I would suggest as a final question that between the cholera outbreak earlier this year and the amounts of drinkable water we're losing based on the lack of infrastructure, we are violating basic human rights. You agree or disagree?
You have to look maybe a little deeper into the scientific components of that. Yes, water is a basic right to everyone. When there's a violation of SANS 241, specifically on the drinking water quality, as the department, we always ensure that there is actually notices and compliance. We give directive to non-complying municipalities because we see that that basic right is basically violated. But of course, the Hamas cholera and the cholera issue is actually an isolated matter, but that doesn't mean that as a country, the quality of drinking water is substandard. On average, we actually have some of the best complying water qualities when it comes to our chemical and also microbiological compliances.
The problem is, I suppose, you can't get that clean drinking water to all the areas that need it. I suppose that's the issue in the end, which is where we started on infrastructure. Appreciate your time this afternoon, all the way from Swakopmund, this conference on the go at the moment. That was Deputy Director of Water and Sanitation Services for the Water and Sanitation Department, Mr. Risimati Mathye, joining us this afternoon. 23 away from